Hello again. My name is Gordon Zell, and delighted to be here to deliver another session on risk management. For those of you that have attended my synchronous course providing the basics of risk management, welcome back. For those of you that wasn't there, you can check out the forum post and can get briefed on some of the basics and the foundation of risk management. This is really a follow-up to that and really builds on that foundation, really specifically on advanced risk analysis and responses so that we can have more rigor in our risk management practices. It's really turning the uh-oh moments into a plan. Risk management, as I've discussed before, is really about thinking ahead so that you can future-proof your project so that you don't panic, you have a backup plan in place. It can apply for projects, which is really how I use most of these rigorous processes, but really it can apply for work or even everyday life. So if you've ever forgotten an umbrella and got soaked, you probably understand a little bit about risk, right? Because it is everywhere. So today, this is what we're going to be covering. A quick recap on risks. I won't spend too much time on that. If you're interested, I did record my synchronous session, so please take a look. I'm really going to be focusing on how we analyze risks that matters most, right? In the last lecture or in the last session, we really talked about, we really don't have all the money or time or resources in the world to address all risks. And so the question becomes, okay, which risks do we want to prioritize? Which risks do we want to address in full versus other risks where we're like, you know what, it could happen, impact may not be so large. You know what, I may have a less robust plan for those, right? I was really thinking about how to respond so that problems that are a high impact or high likelihood don't derail everything, causing our projects to fail. So the key takeaways today you can use immediately. And so I'm hoping that there is a lot of key lessons learned, key lessons here so that you can take away from, and then also providing you with some tools that you can use, right after kind of going through this asynchronous lesson. So objectives of today. So by the end of today, I'm hoping you have a good grasp of how we assess risks using a tool that we use quite commonly in project management. And we call that the probability versus impact matrix. Okay. Don't worry if you haven't heard of that term before. I'm here to introduce it to you. We'll throw some examples against it so that we can find some real application. And then we're also going to use it to basically compare different risks, apples to apples, so that we can kind of compare them and then prioritize them. Okay, we're going to distinguish how we're going to respond to high priority risks versus maybe lower priority risks. There is a structured way of responding to risks or planning for risk responses. I'm going to give you that structure so that you can really put that to use. And then lastly, for the risks that we identify as really, really, really important, really, really, really high priority, what is the appropriate responses to address them in full? Okay, so that's how to determine success by the end of today. We're really going to be hopefully you're going to be reflecting on these, and hopefully I've done a good job impressing on you, and giving you the tools to addressing these things. All right, so a quick scenario. This is a real disaster that happened in Vancouver. Many of you may know this already. The Second Narrows Bridge or the Irons Worker Memorial Bridge, had some failures before getting to the point of what you see it today. This bridge, while it was constructed, collapsed, which led to a tragic loss of life. This happened on the first go at constructing the bridge. Gone through this collapse on June 17th, 1958, and 79 workers fell into the river. and there were 19 fatalities. It was considered the worst construction accident in BC history, and that's why it was later renamed the Iron Workers Memorial Bridge. So how does it relate to risk management? Obviously, after the incident, a whole forensics was done on what caused this accident, and there were a few key things that came from that investigation. So, firstly, changes create new risks. During construction, things change. The methods of construction change. The assessment of loads have changed. The conditions change. And so what happened was that these changes made the structure less stable. And so as change happens, one of the things that we have learned from this is that it introduces new risks. And so having a robust risk management process that that takes into account changes as a project progresses is really, really important. Okay. In this example, another area that relates to risk management, or the lack thereof in this case, is that the changes that led to this collapse was not properly assessed. So adjustments were made, but weren't fully analyzed, especially from a safety perspective. The team did not really fully evaluate what could go wrong if I did this instead. And so the other thing that that comes to mind is that as we go through changes in a project's life cycle, it should trigger a risk reassessment. And then lastly, the third key lesson here was warning signs from emergent risks. So while the bridge was under construction, there were movements, there were deflections, there were deformations that wasn't supposed to happen. And while that was happening, and there were early indications of instability, no one really thought that, that could turn into this disaster. And so active monitoring of risks and then having a response plan to act quickly could have avoided this disaster. So really to say, using this example, is that problems really rarely come from one mistake. They build up over time. Being preemptive, being proactive with our risk monitoring is really, really important and could avoid catastrophic failures. So it's not just something that happens in theory. It is something that is really, really, a really critical cornerstone of good project management practice. So quickly going through, what are risks? So risks are just something that is uncertain, hasn't happened yet, that could affect your goal. Not all risks are bad, right? Oftentimes when we think of risks, we think of all the things that could go wrong. But that's not often the case, right? Sometimes uncertainties can be good, right? So, for example, if I proactively engage with the city, maybe they'll give me my permit quicker, right? Some of those risks or uncertainties could be good. Those are what we call opportunities, right? Bad risks or negative risks, which we call threats, could be related to, for example, you're going on a vacation and your flight could be canceled because of bad weather, right? That's a negative risk, that's a threat. A good risk or a positive risk or an opportunity is, you invest your money and your investment could grow, right? And so risks could really be categorized as negative or positive. When we think about risks, whether good or bad, it's really important to plan ahead or plan for the what ifs, right? When you go on a vacation, you think, okay, well, what could go right? What could go wrong? But oftentimes when we think about vacations that have gone well, generally speaking, it's because we plan for those uncertainties ahead of time, right? We plan for those things as part of our itinerary plan, right? We try to identify problems before they happen. We also plan for what we would do if they were to happen, right? So, that very common approach to risk management that happens in our personal lives is also very much relevant in everyday project management practice. for mega million billion-dollar plus projects. It's really the same concept. It's like bringing a charger on a trip just in case you run out of power. That's good risk management. Backing up your files on a computer because you don't want it to get lost. That's good risk management. Buying snacks before a very, very long meeting so that you have something to eat during that meeting. If you get hungry, it's a survival strategy for most of us in the corporate world, but it's also an example of good risk management, right? So in my lecture or in my session before, we talked about really four steps that is cyclical, right? It is something that you do, and it goes around, right? It is a never-ending loop. You identify your risks, so you find them, you think about them, then you analyze it. Okay, what's important, what's less important? You plan your response. If they were to happen, what would I do? And you keep monitoring, you keep controlling, or you keep watching, right? Not just like do it, set it, forget about it, right? Good risk management is doing that over and over and over again, right? You identify, analyze, plan for it, you monitor to see if it happens. If it happens, then you action your risk response. If it doesn't happen, you keep going around, because just because you identify risks once or analyze risks once, when you're going through a project, what you're going to realize is that, oh, okay, I actually didn't think about that. I should put that in. I should add that to my plan, right? Oftentimes, it's something that we go through over and over and over again. All right. Today, specifically, I'm going to focus on analyzing risks and prioritizing risks, and giving you some advanced tools for how we do those two things. Okay. In my synchronous session, when we talk about analyzing risks, what we did was we just categorized it very generically to, if we identify risks, they're either high, medium, or low, right? That's a really, really simplified way of doing it. It's also very, very subjective, right? What is a high priority risk to you? Maybe a medium priority risk for me. It may be a very low priority risk for Susan, right? So that way of analyzing risks that is subjective and has a certain level of ambiguity isn't the best way to do it, right? Because it's so left up to opinions and judgment of a specific individual. There are more advanced techniques to doing it. I want to introduce one of them to you, okay? And through that technique, we can then say, okay, well, what is a higher priority risks than this? Because risks are so different. It's sometimes hard to say that, out of these 10 things that we've identified, that's number 1 versus that's number 5, or that's ranked number 10 last, right? So there's a structured and systematic way of doing it. Let's talk about that today. Okay. Good. So let's first talk about why risk analysis matter, because not all risks are considered equal. Okay. Some may, but most are not, right? For example, losing your pen versus losing your passport. Both are risks, but they're not equal, right? I would fathom that, most of us would say losing your passport would probably be a higher priority risk, especially if you're going to another country and it is a mandatory requirement to get into those other countries, right? Both are problems, but one can tremendously ruin your trip. So when we as project managers think about risk, it's really about focusing our attention and our energy on where it matters most, because there's a finite amount of that. There's a finite amount of energy, resources, again, time and material. So we want to spend it in the right spots. We want to make sure that we're putting our attention in the right place. Okay, so risk assessments. Just to keep this very, very simple, risk analysis can be really performed either qualitatively or quantitatively. Okay, today's focus will be on the qualitative side. Qualitative risk assessment is basically assessing two things: the probability or the likelihood of that risk happening. How likely is that risk going to occur? That's the first metric. And the second metric under qualitative risk assessment is, if that risk were to happen, how big or how major of an impact would that be? Okay, so that's qualitative. Qualitative risk assessment oftentimes is based on judgment, but using those two metrics. Okay, quantitative is there's numerical techniques, statistical techniques. It uses numbers, uses calculations to generate for individual risks, the uncertainty and its impact on the overall project objectives. Still looking at probability, still looking at impact, but using numerical methods, using statistical methods to generate those results. There are programs for that. There are statistical models for that. And so, it's pretty rigorous, it's pretty time consuming, and it's very, very costly. I won't spend too much, I won't spend any time in that area, but just to note that there are more quantitative, rigorous ways of doing it. So today, let's focus on qualitative risk assessment. Okay, so an example, for example, chance of rain. It rains a lot here in Vancouver, right? So when we think about probability, we may say, hey, you know what, the chance of rain in Vancouver, and we hear the weather person say this, when we're watching the Weather Network, for example, they may say there's an 80% chance of rain tomorrow, right? That's an assessment of that uncertainty or that risk based on probability, 80% chance of it happening. Okay. If it were to happen, if it were to rain tomorrow, what would be the impact? Well, it would impact us in different ways, right? Let's talk about that. Okay, so don't let these tables scare you off. Okay, it's an example that I want to use for us to look at those two metrics. So let's focus on the first table there, probability of occurrence. Usually, just like that weather example, we base it on percentage. What percentage of likelihood is of that risk occurring or of that risk happening? I've given you an example of that with rain, right? So usually we give it a score. In this case here, to simplify this example, we use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5, if I were to give a risk a probability score of 5, in this example here, it would mean there's more than 70% chance of that from happening. So the example I've given you where, it may rain tomorrow in Vancouver. And I said, you know what, there's 80% chance of that happening. For that risk, I would give it a score of 5, right? Because 80% is more than 70. If I were to say, hey, instead of saying tomorrow's likelihood of rain is 80%, and I said it's 20%, what score would I give it? Let's take a pause here. If I say, hey, there's a chance of rain in Vancouver tomorrow, the chance of rain is 20% from the Weather Network, what score would you give this risk? Would it be 1, between 1 and 10%? 2, between 11 and 30%, 3, between 31 and 50%, 4, between 51 and 70%, or 5, more than 70%? So the answer is 2, right? Because 20% chance of rain tomorrow falls between 11 and 30%. So in this case here, I would give that risk a probability score of 2. Okay. So now let's look at impact. So when I talk about impact, it's impact to our goals, or in this case, our project objectives. Let's just use the example. I'm looking at this risk from the perspective of my construction project. Okay. If it rains tomorrow, it may cause me to lose productivity. It may cause me to have a schedule delay of my project, because now people are working slower, people are moving slower, People are being more careful because they're afraid to slip, and therefore I may see that result in a schedule delay, or I may see that result in more costs. Okay, so how we describe impacts, in this case here, we define impacts for this project as impact to time. It could be an impact to cost. It could be impact to the scope of my project. How much work am I doing? Am I doing more work than I planned or less work than I planned? Does it impact quality of my work? Is it going to impact the quality of my production? Is it going to impact the quality of my construction? Okay. Can you use different metrics to describe impact? Sure, right? If you have, I don't know, a wedding project, you may define impact as, a time impact, a cost impact, quality impact, or a customer experience impact, right? So how you describe impact can differ depending on your project. This is just one example, all right? So let's just say this construction project, there's a 20% chance of rain, but if it were to happen and it does rain tomorrow, I'm going to potentially have 5 days of delay because it rained tomorrow. What score would I give it? Would I give it 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? 5 days or 1 week of delay to my project. So in this case here, I would say, hey, okay, well, that's a time delay. So I'm going to look under time. Okay. It's a 1 week delay, relatively minor in the grand scheme of my major, large scale construction. That's a score of 1. Okay. But if I were to say, instead of saying it's a 5-week delay, if it rained tomorrow, it's going to impact critical activities on my construction project. It's going to throw me off really, really horribly. It may cause me to have a 3-week delay. If it was a 3-week delay, you would give that a score of, let's just see here, time, right? 3-week delay, it falls between 1 and 4 weeks. I would give that a score of 2. So basically what I'm trying to describe here is to analyze a risk, we usually give it a score. We usually measure it by likelihood or probability of it happening. And we also give it a score for impact. If it were to happen, what score would I give it? So each risk would have 2 scores, one for probability, one for impact. So now you're going to ask me, okay, well, how does this help me? How does that help me? How does it allow me to compare between different risks, right? If each risk has 2 scores, how does it help me compare and prioritize? Well, it's actually very, very simple. This is a 2x2. What we do is we have each risk has 2 scores, one for probability, one for impact. What we do is we simply multiply it. Okay. So using the last example, we said impact score of 1 because it was a 1-week delay, right? 1. The likelihood of it was 20%, and we said the likelihood, we gave it a score of 2. So that's in the vertical axis. A score of 2 for likelihood, a score of 1 for impact. What's 2 times 1? 2 times 1 is 2, right? So each risk would have a net score. When you multiply the score for likelihood and the score for impact, you get one number. So each risk will, through the multiplication, will get a net score. And in this case here, the net score is what? 2 times 1 is 2, which is right here using this heat map. If it's green, what does that mean? It means it's overall, it's a low priority risk. And if you do that, let's just say for a project, you have 10 risks. For each of those risks, you give it a likelihood score, you give an impact score, you multiply it. So each of those 10 risks will have a net score. So there should be 10 net scores. So maybe risk number 1, you do the multiplication, it has a score of 2. The next risk, you assess, you do the multiplication. That one has a score of, I don't know, likelihood of 3, impact of 3. What's 3 times 3? Now this has become a math lesson. 3 times 3 is 9, right? So 3 for likelihood, 3 for impact. Okay, This one shouldn't be 8, it should be 9. 9. Now that's medium. Why is this helpful? It's helpful because once you get through that, now you can prioritize. Because now each risk has a net score. The higher the net score, the more important it is. So you can see here, the highest number you can get using our formulation here is 5 and 5. 5 and 5 is 25. So the highest score that a risk can have is 25 using this, using the framework that I have here. Which means that if you have a risk that is 25 or 20 or 16, or really what's in red, it's gonna bubble up. Those are the risks that you're gonna focus your attention on and addressing first. If you have risks that have a net score of 1 or 2 or 3, you're kind of in this green zone here, which means that that's gonna sink lower in your priority list. So you're gonna maybe address them last, or maybe you don't spend too much time on it, or maybe you don't spend too much money on it. So this framework here helps you analyze it using a systematic way, looking at two things: likelihood and impact. You use that, you get one score, and then using that one score, you give it ranking. So let's just say, for example, I have a very simple project. I have 3 risks. Risk number 1 have a net score of 25. Another risk number 2 has a score of 12. And then risk number 3 has a score of 2. You're obviously going to say, okay, well, my top risk is the one that's 25, right? So that's rank number 1, top priority. The next one, second, because it has the second highest score. Rank number 2, it's almost like the Olympics, right? You know, the one with the highest score gets gold. The next one gets rank number 2, gets, maybe silver. The next one gets bronze, so on and so forth. This allows us to compare risks apples to apples. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's use the camping example. You're trying to plan a weekend getaway with your friends. You're hoping it's going to look like that. You're hoping your experience will be, how I've described it using that photo. But I don't know. Maybe one of those risks is heavy rain all weekend, right? So instead of getting this, really mystical, sunny, very scenic, very warm type of experience, you're getting maybe potentially a rain and very dreadful experience. Okay, let's just say I'm using this as an example. So let's just say you're planning that and you're saying, hey, you know what? I want to do a risk assessment as part of my planning. Okay? We usually do it preemptively. We're trying to plan ahead, right? You may say, hey, you know what? I looked at the weather network. It says almost 100%. So the probability score for this using that would be 5, right? Very, very high likelihood, more than 70%. That one gets a 5. Then you ask yourself, you know what? It's going to have a really large impact, relatively large impact for us. We're going to need to spend some more money. Between all of our friends, we may have to, let's assume we don't have rain jackets. So each of us have to go to Mountain Warehouse and get a cheap rain jacket. It's going to cost us, each of us, if we total it up, it's going to cost us $250. And it's going to have a significant impact to our experience because we were planning for like a sunny experience, and we're actually getting rain, and we can't cancel the trip because we've already paid the deposit to BC Parks, for example. Okay, what score would you give it? In this case here, for impact, I've structured it where we're just looking at costs and experience. Okay, so in this case here, $250 is more than $200 for us. It's going to have a significant impact to our experience. We're going to give it a 4. Okay. So for this risk here, its likelihood is 5. Impact score is 4. 5 times 4 is 20. So in this case here, it's red in this heat map. So it's considered extreme. As you're planning, you're going to work with your friends, right? You're a very diligent project manager. You're going to think, okay, what else can happen? You may say, oh, if we don't get enough, when we don't bring enough food, this is going to happen. You would go through this exercise again. Okay, if I don't bring enough food, what's the likelihood of that? What's the impact of that? And you give that a score. Oh my gosh, if we leave the food out and a bear or a lot of or it'll attract wildlife. What is the probability of that? What's the impact of that? So you kind of go through, you identify all the things that could go wrong or threats, and you analyze it using this. And then every risk gets a score. And then you can say, okay, well, these ones are higher. Let's focus our attention on those. These risks are lower. Let's, maybe we'll keep that in the back burner. We'll deal with that after, right? So hopefully this is a tool to help you think about risks in a structured way. All right. So that's this is something that I want you to know. I work at TransLink. I'm working on a few major projects. Broadway, Subway, Surrey, Langley are one of them. This concept here is what we use even for those projects. So I'm not just showing you something that's not being used. This is the start of something that could be very robust and actually very, very useful even for those major projects. So please make use of this. Try it out for some of your mini projects in your personal lives, and hopefully you find some use in it. Okay, so the next step there is, it's great. You analyze your risks, you give it a number, you know what's more important, you know what's less important based on the net score that each risk has. Great, excellent. But a risk, the next thing that we have to do, as I've described, is really your response. What are you going to do about it? What's your contingency plan? What's your backup plan? If it were to happen, what am I going to do? Right? If I do attract a bear, what am I going to do? Because I left food out. If it actually does rain, what am I going to do about it? What's my backup plan for that? Right? If I don't put enough fuel in the car to get to my campsite, and that's a risk. If it actually did happen, what am I going to do about that? And so planning risk responses really, really matters, because you don't want to be scrambling when something happens. We've all been in that situation where, we thought something could happen. We didn't really think too much about it. And it actually did happen. And then we didn't have a plan in place, right? And that could be very anxiety inducing. It could cause a lot of stress for us and our spouses or our partners or our project teams. So coming out with risk responses is super, super critical. So there is a structure to it, okay? So I'm going to give you this very simple structure. So there's a general response that we think of first, and then we think about the specific response as a second step. The first step, think about the general response, and there's 5 of them for negative risks or threats, okay? So you can either avoid it, you can escalate it, transfer, mitigate, or accept. So when you think of a risk, after you analyze, and you're now coming up with a plan, you're going to ask yourself, which one of the 5 are you going to use? You can use multiple if you want, but let's think about one that you'll use. If this bad thing were to happen, what would be my first approach? Would I avoid it? Or what that means is, would I eliminate that? Okay. So for example, let's just say I'm a project manager. I'm trying to understand the roof condition. Is the roof of that building in good condition or bad condition? And because I'm a really, really good project manager, I'm thinking, okay, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? Naturally, many of us would say, well, if you send someone to look at the roof and it's really, really high up there, the person can fall, right? The person can fall. So if I said, okay, well, I understand this risk. If I send a person up there, the risk that I've identified is that the person can fall and get seriously hurt or can even die. And I say, you know what? I'm going to avoid that risk. My specific response would basically be, okay, if I'm going to avoid or eliminate that risk, my specific response would be to you know what? I'm not going to send a person up there at all. I'm just going to send a drone up there instead. Basically, what I've done is I basically eliminate that risk entirely through that specific action. Right? So what I've done there was I've identified that someone can fall down the roof. And then I said, hey, you know what? I want to eliminate that risk. I want to avoid that risk entirely. And so my specific response is, I'm not going to send anyone up so that no one can get hurt. I'll send a drone up there instead, right? So that's an example of how we would use avoid or eliminate. And it's also an example of how we structure our thinking to use a generic response first, and then think about the specific action or the specific risk response that is related to that general response. Okay. Escalate. You may say, you know what, I'm going to escalate a risk. So let's just say, for example, I work at Transit. Many of you may work in, in your organizations. And one of the things that always happens is, oh my gosh, I may not have enough money, right? I may not have enough funding because projects always run out of money. For me at Transit, that happens. And so I may say, hey, you know what, for that risk, if it were to happen, if I run out of money, I'm going to escalate. What that means is I'm going to escalate to someone that has more power or more influence than me to deal with this threat, to deal with this risk. So in this specific example is if I say, hey, you know what, I'm running a project. I foresee that I may not have enough money at some point. I'm going to escalate it if that were to happen. So I'm going to escalate it to my boss or to the CEO so that they can go to the federal government or provincial government to get me more money. So you see what I did there, right? I've identified that my general response is escalate, bring it up to my boss. And the specific response is so that my boss can go talk to the government for more money. The generic response and then the specific action. Transfer. Let's go back to the example of the person falling off the roof. You're sending someone up there to inspect the roof. They could fall. That's the risk. You may say, hey, you know what? For that risk, I'm actually, I'm not going to eliminate it. I'm going to, my first response is to transfer. Out of these 5, I'm going to use transfer. What does that mean? So specifically, transfer can be, I'm going to buy insurance. But if that person falls and they get seriously hurt, I'm transferring the risk. I'm transferring the impact to someone else. The insurance company will pay for it. Hopefully you see how that worked, right? I've selected a general risk response, which is transfer, and the specific action that I plan is to buy insurance. Okay. Mitigate, which is the most common response, is something that could reduce the probability of the risk of happening, or reducing the impact of that. So you may say, let's just say again, you're putting someone up on top of the roof, and you say, you know what? My first response is to mitigate. I'm not avoiding. I'm not transferring. You know what? My first response is mitigate. The specific actions I'm going to take to mitigate would be to, I'm going to make sure that there's a safety program in place so that everyone knows what safety looks like when you go up on a roof. I'm going to make sure that they tie off. Make sure that they're going to tie themselves to a roof anchor so that if they fall, at least they're tied back, right? They may get yanked, but at least they won't fall all the way to the ground, right? So mitigate and then specific actions for mitigations. And you can see, right, if they get tied off, it reduces the impact of instead of falling to the floor, they fall a certain instance, or they don't fall at all because they're tied off. If there's a safety program in place, everyone understands protocol, everyone understands what good safety practice looks like, hopefully reducing the probability of it even occurring in the first place. Mitigation. And then lastly, accept. Accepting is just basically accepting that exists and you're not going to do anything about it. Okay. So for example, weather. You know what? I accept that we live, or maybe like just, we live in an earthquake zone here in Vancouver. And you may say, hey, you know what? The fact that we live here, we've accepted that risk ourselves. We basically said, you know what? We've accepted the fact that I live in an earthquake zone and there's not much I'm going to do about it. That's accepting the risk. Okay. So 5 general responses, and then that gets you to think about the specific response. So when we think about responses, what we generally do as project managers is we think, okay, there's the 5. I'm going to choose one of the 5 for each risk, and then I'm going to think about the specific actions that follows. Can you have more than one general? Can you say, hey, can I transfer and also mitigate? Sure. For example, like the person on the roof, you can say, hey, you know what? I'm going to buy insurance, and I'm going to make sure that they're going to be tied off on the roof, and I'm going to make sure that there's a good safety program. I'm going to mitigate and transfer. Sure, you can have more than one, but don't forget, risk responses are not free. Nothing is free, right? If you're going to transfer the risk by buying insurance and you're going to have safety program and you're going to do a tie off, it's going to come at a cost. So for us as project managers, it's always a balancing act. What is enough? What is sufficient? Going back to what you learned earlier about analyzation, that's where that comes in. You may say, hey, you know what? I have a risk that is high likelihood, high probability, 25, a high score. You may say, you know what? That is worth a multitude of different responses. I want to transfer, I want to mitigate, and I want to escalate. Or you may say, you know what? I'm going to avoid that entirely because it's such a high impact, high probability risk. For the lower probability, lower impact risk, you know what? Probability of 1, impact of 1, net score is a 1, super low in the zone, in the green zone. You may say, hey, you know what? I don't have enough money. I'm spending a lot of time and effort and money on those higher priority risks. You know what? For those green risks or for those low net score risks, I'm just going to accept, right? So that's where the responses and the risk assessments go hand in hand. All right. Let's really quickly do one up for the weekend camping trip again. All right. When we think about risks, we use if-then statements, as I've described to or to some of you in my synchronous class. So very simple. You know what? If heavy rain occurs, the first risk here, if heavy rain occurs, the campsite may get flooded, increasing costs and ruining the whole camping experience. You may say, hey, you know what? We're going to mitigate that. We're going to specifically bring a tarp, waterproof tent, set it up on a higher ground. We're going to make sure everyone dressed appropriately, et cetera, et cetera. So the general response and then the specific response. Let's just say, hey, you know what? The second risk I've identified early on is my vehicle breaking down on the way to the campsite. You know, what could happen is the impact is that the trip could be delayed. I might not get to my campsite at all, which would increase costs for me. And of course, I'll be super frustrated. So you may say, hey, you know what? For that risk, I'm going to transfer. I'm going to make sure I buy BCAA before my trip. So if that were to happen, I can have roadside assistant. I can call BCAA up and they can come fix up my car and off I go, right? Or they can pay for towing or whatever else. That's transfer. I'm transferring it to a third party. Last one here. If a group member disagrees with our plans, which, you know, especially with these group initiatives, you know what? The trip experience may be negatively impacted. You know what? We all have friends that are like that. We all have, you know, we all work with different people with a diverse array of opinions. You may say, I'm just going to accept that. I accept the fact that different people have different thoughts. I acknowledge that we have differences. You know what? I'm not going to do anything with this risk. I'm just going to accept it. Okay? So the general response, the specific response. So lastly, we talked a little bit about the risk register. There needs to be a central place where all of this work and thinking goes, right? It's great that you're thinking about it, but let's just say you're planning your camping trip. It's great to have one single spot where everyone puts their thoughts in. You identify the risks, you analyze the risks, you then put your responses all in one place. It's almost like, for example, you're planning a vacation with your friends or your spouse. Many of us, especially those of us that are millennials, can't get away from the Google Sheet, right? We set up a Google Sheet. We put our plans in the Google Sheet. Once it's almost like a one-stop shop. So the risk register is very much that. So it's really just a spreadsheet you identify your risks. You then have, put your scores in it. You get a net score from multiplying probability and impact, and you get a net score. That's how you start prioritizing based on the net score, and that's how you get the ranking, right? Rank 1 is the highest score, 2, 3, second highest, third highest. That's how we rank them. And then lastly, your general response, which is the 5 that I've showed you for threats. And then what are your specific actions that goes with that? Okay. So I will share this in the forum post if you want to, if you want to test drive this and see how useful it could be. And so that really brings me to the end here. Really the key takeaways here is having a systematic way of assessing risks and prioritizing risks and coming up with risk responses is super helpful. It's super helpful because it frames your thinking. It's also really, really critical because oftentimes when you're working in a team, you're doing it together as a group. Different people may have different ways of thinking about risks, analyzing it, planning responses. So having one way to do it for everyone and having a risk register where there's a central repository for everyone to use to do it together is super helpful, right? And so, I basically synthesize all of those bullet points in what I've just said. And lastly, of course, is an iteration. It's an ongoing process. You do it once. You may say, hey, you know what? In 2 weeks' time, when you're on the trip, some of those priority levels have changed. Maybe the probability has changed. For example, when you first plan a trip, you may say, hey, you know what? There's a high likelihood of rain. But as you're 1 day ahead, right before the trip, that probability may have changed because the weather network may have said, you know what? There's only 20% chance of it raining tomorrow. So you're going to then adjust your scores, right? So it's the risk register is a living document, but it can only be a living document when everyone, including yourself as the project manager, make sure that it's updated on an ongoing basis. And also your risk responses should be updated on an ongoing basis. Okay? So those are the key takeaways. And so I'd like you to self-reflect, if you've watched this in full, I really appreciate you doing that. Hopefully it got you thinking, especially if this is not in your everyday practice. I really love to hear from you. Like, think of a real situation in your life, could be school, work, travel, whatever it is. Think about one risk that you face in that situation and how you would manage it. So I love to hear your thought process on what could go wrong, using the probability and an impact matrix that what's the likelihood of that happening, what could be the potential impact, and then what's a risk response, what's the general risk response, what would you do, would you mitigate, would you accept, and then what's the specific response that you would have to take that's related to that general response to either reduce that risk or to at least have a plan in place to address it. So looking forward to our conversation on the forum. Again, I really appreciate your time. And again, if you have any questions, please do reach out. And looking forward to hearing from you on the forum.